Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Have you ever, glanced at an exchange rate and just wondered what's really going on behind those numbers?
It happens all the time, doesn't it? Those fluctuations seem mysterious.
Exactly. And you sent us this really fascinating deep dive into a pretty lively discussion. It was from an online community for expats living in the Philippines.
Ah, right. And it was all centered around currency changes, the peso and the dollar specifically.
Yeah, the spark was this one user asking something quite direct. Is the USD getting stronger? Simple question, right?
It seems simple. But as we started digging into that conversation, it quickly became clear the picture was, let's say, a lot more nuanced.
Definitely more complex. The
Yeah.
sort of consensus emerging from the community, it suggested it might be more accurate to say the Philippine peso, the PHP, was weakening.
And not just against the dollar, right? That was the key thing. It seemed to be weakening against multiple global currencies.
Precisely. So our mission today is really to pull out the most important insights from that whole exchange. We'll explore, the economic drivers behind these shifts.
And what they actually mean for people on the ground. Like if you're earning foreign currency versus earning in pesos.
Right. And the ripple effects, too, the surprising ones across daily life, food costs, local policy, even global trade stuff.
It gets pretty interconnected. Should be some real aha moments, I think.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
Okay, so the starting point was that user's observation, this idea of the USD getting stronger.
And the immediate reactions were very human, very relatable.
Totally. We saw comments like, okay, time to make those big purchases, or, suddenly my overseas income feels even better.
Yeah, it clearly hits home when your foreign cash suddenly stretches further locally.
But what was fascinating was how quickly the collective wisdom in that group kind of stepped in to reframe it.
Right. It wasn't just about the dollar's perceived strength. People decisively pointed towards the peso's weakness.
Yeah, someone put it really directly. They said, peso's getting weaker. And then they pointed out the British pound hitting a 10-year high against the peso.
Mm-hmm. Which suggests, as they said, it's the peso being weak, not necessarily the pound and dollar just being super strong across the board.
That distinction feels crucial, doesn't it?
It really is. And others echoed that. People mentioned similar peso depreciation against the Canadian dollar, the euro.
The yen, Swedish krona, even the Singapore dollar came up.
Yeah, like that example someone gave about the pound. They remembered it being 100 pesos to the pound way back when.
Then dipping down to, 61 pesos in 2022?
And now climbing back towards 77 pesos. That's a significant swing. It paints a picture.
So it begs the question, what's actually driving this broad weakening of the peso?
Well, the discussion highlighted a couple of key macroeconomic factors. The main one seems to be these diverging interest rate policies.
Okay, explain that a bit.
So Bangko Sentral, that's the Philippine central bank, was apparently expected to cut its interest rate. Meanwhile, the U.S. Federal Reserve, despite earlier predictions of maybe several cuts this year, is now signaling perhaps just one cut, or maybe even none.
Right, so opposite directions, basically.
Exactly. And when a central bank cuts rates, it generally makes holding that currency less attractive for foreign investors looking for higher returns.
So capital might flow out, demand for the peso drops?
Precisely. And if the U.S. Fed keeps rates higher, the dollar stays relatively attractive, which just adds pressure on the peso.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. That explains a big chunk of it. But there was another interesting point raised, too, about gold.
Ah, yes, the Philippines being a net seller of gold. Someone mentioned they apparently disposed of, 29.4 tons just in 2024?
Yeah, and some in the community felt this practice adds to the peso's long-term slide.
The thinking there, I suppose, is that selling off national gold reserves could be read by markets as a sign of maybe financial vulnerability or less confidence in the currency.
Potentially affecting investor sentiment, yeah. Though someone did wisely add that currency prediction is, very hard.
Always a good caveat. And then there was that really interesting seasonal pattern someone brought up.
Oh, yeah, the June versus December thing.
Right. You can repeat this every year. Around June, PHP is at its weakest, and to Hurricane, it will peak.
That suggests something more cyclical, maybe less about immediate policy and more about predictable flows.
Could be. Things like peak seasons for remittances from overseas workers, or certain export cycles, regular annual patterns.
It's also worth noting someone did mention a looming conflict as a background factor, geopolitics.
True. Broader uncertainty can definitely cause a flight to currencies seen as safer, which could indirectly weaken others, like the peso.
So, okay, if we tie all these threads together,
Yeah.
what does it actually mean for people living there? It looks like vastly different things.
Absolutely. For expats, particularly those earning in foreign currencies like the US dollar while living in the Philippines, well, it's undeniably a good period in that sense.
Like that user said, you get more bang for your buck. Your conversions just yield more pesos.
Your income simply buys more locally. It stretches further.
That's the immediate upside for some.
Hmm.
But then the flip side of that coin, it sounds much starker.
It really is. For locals earning their wages in pesos, this depreciation is a significant economic challenge.
Yeah, one user expressed real frustration, saying Filipinos should be upset with their government, not the rest of the world, about the currency weakening.
And this is where you see those ripple effects hitting daily life hard.
Right. Imported goods just get way more expensive.
Fuel prices jump, and that pushes up the cost of almost everything else, transport, manufacturing.
And crucially, the price of rice, which is such a fundamental staple in the Filipino diet.
And the Philippines imports a huge amount of rice, right? They're the world's top importer because local production often doesn't meet demand or isn't cost competitive enough.
Which makes the situation really complex. The government imports tons of rice, often selling it below market value, trying to control inflation, keep food available.
But here's the twist that came up in the discussion. The government's own price controls on rice grown domestically can actually hurt local farmers because those price controls typically don't apply if the rice is exported. So farmers, facing maybe losses selling locally due to the controlled low prices,
are actually incentivized to export their harvest instead, where they can get a better price internationally.
Exactly. And then paradoxically, the Philippines ends up importing rice back, often from places like Thailand, Vietnam, China, which is then sold at higher prices because it's not subject to those domestic price controls.
Wow. So it creates this cycle where policies meant to help might, well, as one user put it very strongly.
Yeah, they felt it had royally fact farmers and seemed more like virtue signaling than sound economics.
Which ultimately could increase reliance on imports and lead to higher prices for essentials when the currency weakens, like now.
It just highlights how tangled these global and local policies get. The discussion even touched on worries that these economic pressures could lead to more social instability, maybe even more crime.
And it's important to remember, this situation in the Philippines isn't happening in isolation. While that expat community saw the USD strengthening against the PHP.
Right. Elsewhere, the narrative around the dollar was, well, quite contradictory, wasn't it?
Yeah, the sources we looked at also had discussions about the USD potentially going to weaken or crashing versus NTD, the Taiwanese dollar.
Nosediving, falling so much against other currencies, causing problems for investors in those markets.
So you have the dollar looking strong against the peso, clearly. But at the same time, globally, there were worries about it depreciating against, say, the euro.
And the Korean won hitting a 16-year low against the euro, not the dollar. Even against the Vietnamese dong, despite reports of the dong itself losing value overall.
It's complex. It just underscores how dynamic and sort of localized currency values can be, right? Strength is very relative.
Highly relative. Depends entirely on the specific currency pair you're looking at and all the economic factors playing out in each region.
So what does this all boil down to for you listening? We've seen how a seemingly simple observation, the dollar getting stronger against the peso, it just opens up this much deeper view of global economics.
Yeah, from those central bank interest rate decisions, Banco Central versus the U.S. Fed, to the Philippines selling gold reserves, even those predictable seasonal currency flows, every little detail matters.
And we've really explored the contrasting impacts, a definite plus for expats earning foreign currency, getting more bang for your buck.
But a really significant challenge for locals dealing with rising costs for imports, fuel, and especially that staple, rice.
Which does raise a pretty important question, I think, for all of us to consider. In a world where these currency swings can hit the cost of essentials so hard, particularly a staple like rice in the Philippines,
Yeah.
what responsibility do governments really have?
To ensure food security, to protect local industries.
Exactly. And thinking bigger picture, what does it mean for global supply chains when domestic policies, maybe like price controls, inadvertently push farmers to export rather than supply their own country?
Creating that cycle of import reliance that then gets slammed by currency shifts?
Yeah. It's definitely something to mull over next time you're thinking about a purchase or just glancing at the headlines.